The history we were taught is a comfortable lie, a sanitized sequence of events designed to keep us from looking too closely at the gaps in our own timeline. We are told that the 19th century was an era of slow, grinding progress, a transition from the horse and carriage to the steam engine. But when you look at the photographs from that period, something feels fundamentally wrong. You see grand, sprawling metropolises with architecture so sophisticated, it defies the primitive tools of the time, yet the streets are hauntingly empty. Where did the people go? And more importantly, where did the new ones come from? Today, we are opening a file that the gatekeepers of history have tried to keep sealed. We are investigating the Great Reset of the 19th century and the disturbing evidence of a global program for the mass cultivation of children. Imagine walking through the streets of San Francisco, New York, or Paris in the mid-1800s. You see massive stone structures, intricate cathedrals, and government buildings that look like they were built for giants. Yet in these early daguerreotypes, there is a chilling silence. The windows are dark, the plazas are vacant, and the few figures you do see look like they don't belong in the grandeur surrounding them. They look like squatters in a palace they didn't build. This is the first clue in a mystery that spans continents, the phenomenon of the empty cities. Historians claim the long exposure times of early cameras blurred out moving people, but that doesn't explain why the horses, the carts, and the bustling life of a functional city are nowhere to be found. It looks as though a civilization was wiped out, leaving behind its infrastructure for someone else to inherit. But a city cannot function without a workforce. If a global catastrophe, what some call the mud flood, erased the previous inhabitants, how did the New World Order repopulate the planet so quickly? The answer lies in a series of events that are hidden in plain sight, dismissed as charitable movements or medical curiosities. We are talking about the sudden, inexplicable explosion of the global orphan population. Between 1850 and 1920, millions of children appeared across the globe with no traceable lineage. They were the foundlings, the street urchins, and the passengers of the infamous orphan trains. From 1854 to 1929, an estimated 250,000 children were shipped from the east coast of the United States to the west. We are told this was a benevolent effort by Charles Loring Brace and the Children's Aid Society to find homes for the homeless. But look closer at the logistics. These children were often treated like livestock. They were lined up on train platforms, inspected by strangers, and handed over to anyone who needed labor. Their identities were erased, their pasts deleted. This wasn't just happening in America. In Europe, foundling hospitals were being built on a scale that suggests an industrial output of human beings. The Great Foundling Hospital in London and similar institutions in Russia and Italy were processing thousands of infants a year. But where were all these babies coming from? This is where the narrative takes a truly surreal turn. At the turn of the century, a bizarre attraction began appearing at world's fairs and boardwalks like Coney Island. They were called infant incubators. Thousands of people paid admission to see rows of premature babies in glass boxes. We are told these were life-saving medical exhibitions run by a man named Martin Cowney because hospitals refused to invest in the technology. But ask yourself, why was the salvation of human life turned into a carnival sideshow? And why do we see vintage postcards from this same era depicting babies being grown in cabbage patches, harvested from plants, or delivered in crates? To the modern mind, these postcards are just Victorian humour. But in the context of the empty cities and the orphan trains, they look like something else entirely. A psychological conditioning program. If you were a child raised in an institution with no mother or father, and you were told you were found or harvested, you would have no choice but to believe it. These postcards were the explanation for a generation that had no roots. They were being prepared to inhabit a world they didn't create, to serve a system they didn't understand. The scale of this operation is staggering. We see massive buildings dedicated to child cultivation under the guise of schools and asylums. We see the re-education of the youth, where the true history of the previous civilization was stripped away and replaced with the narrative we hold today. The 19th century reboot wasn't just about clearing the land, it was about manufacturing a new humanity, a blank slate population that would work the factories, build the railroads, and never question why their cities looked like they were built by gods. As we peel back the layers of this silent history, the pieces begin to fit together with a terrifying precision. The empty cities provided the stage, the Great Reset cleared the players, and the mass cultivation of children provided the new cast. We are the descendants of that reboot. Our ancestors were the children of the trains, the products of the incubators, and the orphans of a forgotten world. The secret of the 19th century isn't just about what was lost, it's about how we were made. And once you see the patterns, you can never look at a history book the same way again. The silence of the mid-19th century is not a technical limitation of the camera. It is a profound historical void. When we examine the high-resolution scans of these early photographs, the detail is breathtaking. We can see the texture of the stone, the intricate ironwork of the street lamps, and the reflection in the glass of the windows. The technology was capable of capturing the world in stunning clarity, yet the absence of life is absolute. In cities designed to house hundreds of thousands, we see perhaps 3 or 4 lonely figures standing on a corner, often looking dazed or out of place. This is the ghost city phenomenon, and it isn't restricted to one region. From the sprawling boulevards of St. Petersburg to the colonial outposts in Australia and the burgeoning hubs of South America, the story is the same. The architecture is uniform, magnificent, Greco-Roman inspired, heavy masonry that seems to have appeared out of nowhere. We are told these were built by pioneers and settlers using horse-drawn carts and hand tools, often in the middle of gold rushes or civil wars. The logistics simply do not add up. How do you build a city like Chicago or San Francisco in a matter of decades with a population that is supposedly struggling to survive on the frontier? The official narrative suggests that these cities were built to showcase the progress of the New World, but the sheer volume of these impossible structures points toward a pre-existing infrastructure. If these cities were already there, what happened to the people who built them? This is where the concept of the mud flood enters the frame. Across the globe, we see buildings with buried first floors. Windows that are half submerged in the earth, doors that have been converted into windows, and vast subterranean levels that are far more ornate than a simple basement would require. This isn't just architectural style or settling, it is evidence of a global cataclysm that deposited layers of earth across the world's urban centres. And in the wake of this event, the survivors were few. The world was a vast empty museum, and the new owners needed a way to fill it. They needed a population that wouldn't remember the world before the flood. They needed children. The industrialization of the human being began in the mid-1800s. While the elite were busy mapping out the new borders and claiming the empty palaces, the machinery of the foundling system was being cranked into high gear. In Moscow, the foundling hospital was a city within a city, housing thousands of children at any given time. The mortality rates were horrific, yet the supply of infants never seemed to dwindle. Where were these children coming from? The numbers suggest something far more systematic than simple poverty or social stigma. It was as if the human race was being harvested from a source that has been erased from our records. Consider the Cabbage Patch postcards again. We are told to laugh at the absurdity of a baby being pulled from a giant vegetable or delivered by a stork. But why was this imagery so prevalent during the exact same years that the orphan trains were running? Why was the idea of manufacturing children so deeply embedded in the popular culture of the time? It served as a massive psychological operation. To a child who had been separated from their parents, these stories provided a whimsical, non-threatening explanation for their existence. It removed the need for a biological lineage. It made the child a product of the state or of nature rather than a member of a family with a history. This is the ultimate tool of control, to give a person a life but take away their past. The orphan train movement itself is a masterpiece of historical redirection. It is framed as a triumph of American charity, a way to save the wild children of the New York slums. But if you look at the records of the Children's Aid Society, you find a darker reality. Many of these children were not orphans at all. They had parents, immigrants, poor labourers, the undesirables of the old world. Their children were taken, often under the guise of temporary care, and then shipped thousands of miles away to be renamed and redistributed. This was a forced migration, a demographic re-engineering of the American continent. The children were the human resource used to populate the vast empty spaces between the newly claimed cities. They were the blank slates upon which the new history would be written. As these children grew up, they were placed into industrial schools and reformatories. These were not institutions of learning in the sense we understand today. They were factories of the mind. The curriculum was designed to produce a compliant workforce, skilled in the trades necessary to maintain the inherited infrastructure, but stripped of the intellectual capacity to question its origins. They were taught the official history, the story of the brave pioneers, the slow march of progress, and the glorious future of the industrial age. The magnificent stone cities they lived in were explained away as the work of their immediate ancestors, despite the obvious lack of technology to build them. And because these children had no parents to tell them otherwise, no grandparents to share stories of the old world, they believed it. The memory of the previous civilization was extinguished in a single generation. The infant incubator exhibits were the final piece of the puzzle. They were the public face of this new human manufacturing process. By putting premature babies on display, the system was desensitizing the public to the idea of children being raised by machines, in institutions, without the traditional family structure. It was a spectacle that masked a grim reality. While the crowds marveled at the miracle of science, the state was perfecting the art of raising humans in a controlled environment. These incubators weren't just about saving lives, they were about demonstrating the state's ownership of life itself. The children in those glass boxes were the prototypes for the modern citizen, monitored, regulated, and disconnected from the natural order. We must also look at the World's Fairs of the 19th and early 20th centuries. These were not just exhibitions of technology, they were pop-up versions of the New World Order. They were built with incredible speed, using materials like staff, a mixture of plaster and hemp that looked like stone but was designed to be temporary, or so we are told. Many of these fairgrounds were built on the sites of the original Tartarian cities. The fairs were a way to reskin the ancient architecture, to give it a temporary, celebratory feel before it was demolished or destroyed by fire. The fires of the 19th century are another massive anomaly. Nearly every major city, Chicago, Boston, San Francisco, Seattle, suffered a great fire that leveled the downtown area. These fires were incredibly convenient. They allowed the new administrators to clear away the remaining evidence of the old world and rebuild the cities in their own image, using the blank slate population they had cultivated. The 19th century Reboot was a global event, coordinated with a precision that suggests a central authority. Whether it was the foundlings of Russia, the stolen generations of Australia, or the orphan trains of America, the objective was the same: the replacement of a rooted, knowledgeable population with a disconnected, dependent one. We see the remnants of this process in our own lives today. The obsession with credentials, the reliance on official sources, and the fear of questioning the established narrative are the psychological echoes of the incubator generation. We are still living in the shadow of the Great Reset, walking through cities we don't understand, and repeating a history that was written for us by the very people who erased our true identity. The evidence is all around us, hidden in plain sight. In the buried windows of our old buildings, the missing records of our ancestors, and the surreal postcards of our humorous past. The secret of the 19th century is that we are a civilization with amnesia. We have been told who we are, but we have forgotten where we came from. The children of the incubators were not just a medical curiosity, they were the foundation of our modern world, and until we understand their story, we will never truly be free. In every corner of the globe, the narrative of the 19th century follows a suspiciously similar script. A sudden awakening of human ingenuity and a burst of architectural and technological prowess that seems to have no logical predecessor. In the United States, this is often called the Gilded Age, a period of immense wealth and rapid expansion. But how did a nation supposedly torn apart by a brutal civil war suddenly find the resources to build thousands of miles of railroads, massive stone capitals, and sprawling industrial complexes? The official answer is industrialization, but that is a label, not an explanation. If you look at the actual construction logs and architectural plans of the time, you find a disturbing lack of detail. There are reconstructions and renovations, but very few records of the actual foundational work for these massive structures. It is as if the heavy lifting had already been done. This leads us back to the children. A population with no memory of the before is the perfect labor force for a reconstruction. They don't ask why the stones of the new courthouse look hundreds of years older than the city itself, or why the new sewage systems and electrical grids seem to integrate perfectly with ancient foundations. They are simply grateful for the work, for the food, and for the identity provided by the state. The industrial schools were the primary tool for this transformation, massive, fortress-like buildings where children were kept in a state of constant labour and indoctrination. These were often massive, fortress-like buildings where children were kept in a state of constant labour and indoctrination. They were taught that their previous lives, if they remembered them at all, were sinful, chaotic, and uncivilized. The state was their new father, the school was their new mother. The psychological impact of this mass orphanhood cannot be overstated. When you strip a human being of their ancestry, you create a profound sense of ontological insecurity. You make them easy to manipulate because they have no ground to stand on. This is why the 19th century reboot was so successful. It didn't just change the maps, it changed the human psyche. The modern man was born in the 19th century, a man who looks to the future because he is terrified of the past. He is a man who values progress above all else because he has been taught that anything old is primitive and irrelevant. This was the ultimate victory of the reset, to make the survivors of a grand civilization believe they were the first civilized people to ever walk the earth. We see this reflected in the great exhibitions and world's fairs that dominated the era. These events were massive rituals of indoctrination, presenting a vision of the future carefully curated by the new elite. The White City of the 1893 Chicago World's Fair is a perfect example. It was a breathtaking display of neoclassical architecture, shimmering white buildings, and advanced electrical lighting. The public was told it was a temporary marvel, built in just a few years to celebrate the 400th anniversary of Columbus. But many researchers now believe that the White City was not a temporary construction at all. It was a reclaimed portion of the old world, reskinned and rebranded for the new era. When the fair was over, most of these magnificent buildings were destroyed by fire or demolished, leaving only a few monuments behind. Why would a civilization struggling with poverty and infrastructure destroy such magnificent buildings? Unless, of course, they had to. Unless those buildings held clues to a history that couldn't be allowed to remain. The fires of the 19th century were not just accidents, they were controlled deletions. They occurred with a frequency and a thoroughness that is statistically impossible. In city after city, the Old Quarter, the area with the most ornate and impossible architecture, was the part that burned. The official reports always blame a kicked lantern, a faulty stove, or a careless worker. But the result was always the same: the erasure of the architectural record and the displacement of the remaining Old World population. This cleared the way for the new cities, built on the foundations of the old, but designed for the new incubator population. The foundling wheels of Europe are another chilling detail in this global program. These were wooden cylinders built into the walls of churches and hospitals. A mother could place her baby in the wheel, turn it, and the child would be taken inside, no questions asked. While this is presented as a mercy to prevent infanticide, it was in practice a state-sanctioned human collection system. It allowed for the mass anonymization of the population. Once a child passed through the wheel, their identity was gone. They were now property of the institution. In some cities, the number of children processed through these wheels was staggering. In Naples, for example, it is estimated that nearly half of the population had some foundling ancestry. This wasn't just a local issue, it was a demographic shift of epic proportions. The connection between the incubator babies and the repopulation theory is strengthened when we look at the locations of these exhibits. They weren't just at Coney Island, they were at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, the Louisiana Purchase Exposition in St. Louis, and the Lewis and Clark Centennial Exposition in Portland. They were everywhere the New World was being celebrated. The incubator was the symbol of the new era, a world where life is a technological achievement, not a biological mystery. It was the scientific version of the Cabbage Patch, telling the public, "We don't need mothers, we don't need fathers, we have the machine and the state." This narrative of cultivation extends even to the language we use today. We culture bacteria, we cultivate crops, and in the 19th century, they began to cultivate a new kind of human. The kindergarten movement, which gained massive popularity during this period, literally means children's garden. While we think of it as a place of play, its origins were deeply rooted in the idea of pruning and shaping the young mind in a controlled environment, away from the influence of the family. The goal was to create a uniform, standardized population, a human crop that could be harvested for the needs of the industrial machine. As we look at the official history of the 19th century, we must ask ourselves, who wrote this story? The answer is the victors of the Reboot, the ones who inherited the empty cities, organized the orphan trains, and ran the incubator exhibits. They didn't just win a war, they won the timeline. They created a closed loop of information where every anomaly is explained away as a quirk of history or a limitation of technology. But the anomalies are too numerous and the patterns are too consistent. The 19th century was not a time of slow progress. It was a time of rapid, violent, and total transformation. It was the birth of our world, but it was also the death of another. The children of the 19th century were the bridge between these two worlds. They carried the physical traits of the old world, but the mental programming of the new, building the new world using tools provided by their guardians, never realizing they were merely polishing the relics of their own ancestors. When we look into the eyes of the children in those old photographs, the breaker boys in the mines, the newsies on the street corners, the foundlings in the wards. We aren't just looking at victims of poverty. We are looking at the survivors of a global amnesia and the architects of our own misunderstanding. This dossier is a testament to the fact that truth cannot be fully erased. It leaves traces in the architecture, in the records, and in the collective subconscious of the people. The 19th century reboot is the key to understanding why our world feels so new and yet so old. It explains why we feel like strangers in our own cities and why we are so easily controlled by narratives of fear and progress. We are the children of the incubators, still waiting for someone to tell us where we truly came from. But the answer isn't in a history book, it's in the stones of the cities, the silence of the photographs, and the deep, unsettling feeling that the world we see is only a reskin of something much greater. The logistical reality of the empty cities is perhaps the most damning evidence against the official narrative. Take, for example, the city of Chicago. In 1830, it was a tiny trading post with a handful of residents, yet by 1890, it had transformed into a world-class metropolis with a population of over 1 million, featuring some of the most advanced architecture and infrastructure on the planet. We are told this was the result of unprecedented growth, but growth requires more than just people. It requires a level of engineering and resource management that was simply not available to a frontier population. To build a city of that scale from scratch in just 60 years would require a modern industrial supply chain, a massive fleet of heavy machinery, and a highly specialized workforce. Instead, the official narrative claims it was done with horses, pulleys, and manual labor. The mudflood evidence in Chicago is particularly striking. During the 1850s and 60s, the city underwent a massive lifting project where we are told the entire city was raised by several feet to improve drainage and install a sewer system. They allegedly used thousands of jack screws to lift entire blocks of buildings, massive stone structures, while people were still inside. While this is presented as a feat of pioneer ingenuity, it raises a fundamental question. Why would you build a city on a swamp in the first place, only to lift it a few years later? A more logical explanation is that the city was already there, buried in a layer of mud from a previous cataclysm, and the lifting was actually an excavation and renovation project to make the buried first floors functional again. This would explain why so many newly built structures already feature deep, ornate basements that appeared designed to be the original ground floors. The people doing this lifting and renovating were the new population, many of them foundlings and orphans trained in industrial schools. They were told they were building the future when they were actually just uncovering the past. This pattern repeats in city after city across the American West. San Francisco, Denver, and Salt Lake City all feature impossible architecture that seems to have appeared overnight. And all of them share a history of great fires that conveniently cleared away the old parts of the city just as the new population was becoming established. The orphan trains provided the demographic filler for these reclaimed territories, but they were only one part of a much larger global system. In Australia, the stolen generations involved the systematic removal of Aboriginal children from their families to be civilized in state-run institutions. While often discussed as a racial issue, it was also a reboot issue, an effort to break the connection to the land and the history of the previous civilization. In Canada, residential schools served the same purpose, to create a blank slate population that would accept the new narrative without question. The role of the World's Fairs in this process cannot be overstated. These were not just fairs. They were indoctrination centers designed to overwhelm the senses and make the public feel small and insignificant in the face of progress. The Midway Plaisance at the Chicago World's Fair featured living ethnological exhibits where people from cultures deemed primitive were put on display like animals in a zoo. This was a deliberate attempt to create a hierarchy of civilization, with the New World Order at the top. It taught the Incubator generation that they were the pinnacle of human achievement and that anything that came before them was savage and obsolete. But the most disturbing aspect of the world's fairs was the infant incubator exhibits. These were often located on the midway, right next to the freak shows and the exotic dancers. Why? Because the manufactured human was the ultimate freak show, a display of the state's power to create and sustain life outside of the natural order. The man who ran these exhibits, Martin Cowney, was a mysterious figure who claimed to be a doctor but had no verifiable medical credentials. He operated these exhibits for decades, charging admission to see his babies. The official story is that hospitals sent these infants to him because they couldn't care for them. But in an era where thousands of children were being found every day, it's not hard to imagine a more sinister source. The incubator babies were the first generation of pure state-raised humans, prototypes for a society where the family is secondary to the institution. This model was exported across the globe, leading to the rise of eugenics in the early 20th century, a science dedicated to the improvement of the human race through controlled breeding and sterilization. This was the logical conclusion of the incubator philosophy. If the state can cultivate humans like crops, it can also weed out the ones it deems unfit. The 19th century Reboot was the foundation for the horrors of the 20th century, the world wars, the genocides, and the rise of the total state. As we look back at the secret of the 19th century, we begin to see that our modern world is not the result of progress, but the result of a reset. We are living in a simulated civilization, built on the ruins of a much greater one. Our history is a script, our identity is a product, and our cities are a stage. The mass cultivation of children was the mechanism that allowed this simulation to become reality, creating a population that was physically present but mentally disconnected. But the connection is not entirely lost. It survives in the anomalies that the system can't quite explain away, in the feeling of awe we get when we look at an old stone building that seems to hum with a forgotten energy, and in the dreams of a world that was brighter, grander, and more connected than the one we live in today. This investigation is a tool for reconnecting those broken wires. It is a way to look at the incubator babies not as a medical miracle, but as a warning, and to see the empty cities not as a camera error, but as a crime scene. The 19th century Reboot was a heist, a theft of human history on a global scale. But the thieves left behind too much evidence: the buried windows, the impossible architecture, and the orphan records. And most importantly, they left us. We are the descendants of the cultivated generation, but we are also the ones who can break the cycle. We can stop looking at the future they have planned for us and start looking at the past they have hidden from us. The truth is not out there, it's back there, in the silence of the 19th century. The story of the incubator children is our story. It's the story of how we were found in the ruins of a great civilization and raised to be the servants of a new one. But the incubator is only a box, and the box can be broken. Once you realize that your history is a lie, you are no longer an orphan of the state. You are a survivor of the reset, and a survivor has a power that the cultivators can never understand: the power to remember. The Great Reset of the 19th century was meant to be the final word on human history, a permanent state of industrial progress and state control. But they underestimated the resilience of the human spirit. They underestimated our ability to see the patterns, to ask the questions, and to find the truth in the gaps of their narrative. This investigation is still being written. Every time you look at an old photograph and see the empty streets for what they really are, you are adding a page. Every time you walk past a buried window and recognize it as a piece of a lost world, you are adding a page. The secret of the 19th century reboot is that the reboot failed. It erased the records, but it couldn't erase the reality. The mass cultivation of children created a new population, but it couldn't create a new soul. We are still the same humans who built the grand cathedrals, the magnificent star forts, and the impossible cities. We have just been told a different story about ourselves, and now that story is changing again. The truth is coming into focus, and the world will never be the same. When we stand before the massive stone facades of our modern capitals, we are often told to feel a sense of national pride, to see them as symbols of our democracy or our industrial might. But if we look with eyes that have seen the truth, we see something else. The repurposed temples of a civilization that understood the harmony between architecture, energy, and the human spirit. We see the inheritance that was claimed by force and managed by a new elite who didn't understand the tools they were using. The 19th century reboot was a downgrade disguised as an upgrade. It replaced free energy with fuel, wisdom with education, and family with the state. The incubator was the physical manifestation of this downgrade. It took the most sacred and natural process, the birth and nurturing of a child, and turned it into a mechanical, public spectacle. It was a signal to the world that the old ways were dead. No longer would a child be born into a lineage of knowledge and tradition. They would be born into a system of regulation and utility. This is the secret at the heart of our modern malaise. We feel empty because we are living in empty cities, raised by empty systems, following an empty history. But the emptiness is an illusion. The old world didn't just vanish, it was overlaid. It's still there, beneath the mud, behind the plaster, and inside our own DNA. The cultivation program was thorough, but it wasn't perfect. It couldn't account for the genetic memory of the human race. It couldn't account for the orphans eventually looking for their historical parents. The 19th century reboot was a temporary success, a dark age that lasted for over a century, but the light is beginning to break through. The ghost cities are starting to speak. The incubator babies are starting to wake up. We are realizing that we are not the accidental products of a chaotic history, but the intentional survivors of a deliberate reset. With that realization comes a responsibility to reclaim our inheritance, rebuild our connections, and write a new history based not on official lies, but on forbidden truths. This dossier is the key to your own identity. It is the map to a world that was stolen from you. You are a descendant of the heaven bearers, the builders of the impossible, and the keepers of the eternal. As we conclude this investigation, remember that the narrative is only as strong as your willingness to believe it. The empty cities are only empty if you refuse to see the life that was there. The incubator babies are only orphans if you refuse to see the family they belong to. The 19th century was a reboot, but you are the system that can't be deleted. Stay vigilant. Keep questioning.